Imagine being born into a world where love is weakness, where your mother doesn't cradle you but holds her breath, praying to the gods that you survive. Your life decided by strangers who have never known warmth. Welcome to Sparta, not just a city, but a furnace where human beings are forged, beaten, and tempered into weapons, where fear is outlawed and pain is the only god. This is not some myth. This is reality. This was Sparta. Before you had a name, before you even breathed your first breath, the elders judged your body. Too small, too soft, too weak. You were discarded like worthless scraps. Mount Taygetus, the towering mountain above Sparta, didn't care for prayers, nor did it hear the cries of infants. It swallowed the weak whole and buried them in its shadows, never to be seen again. Survived that first trial? You were bathed not in water, but in wine, to test your very soul, to see if the weak part of you would drown. If you cried, you were shamed before you could walk. If you convulsed, you were left to die in silence. You learned to sleep not in comfort, but in the cold dark of terror, to sit in silence so deafening, your ears would ring long after. Hunger gnawed at your body, but you learned to ignore it, for comfort was poison. Comfort killed warriors before they ever lived. You weren't even allowed a name until you earned it with blood, sweat, and tears. At age 7, the state took you. You were stripped of every shred of comfort you ever knew. The Agorge wasn't a school. It was a slaughterhouse, a grinding machine where boys were made into monsters. 10 years of relentless pain, starvation, and survival. No love, no mercy, just survival. One cloak, threadbare and filthy. No shoes, even when the ground was frozen and biting. Food, just enough to keep you from falling, but never enough to satisfy. You were told to steal, encouraged to do whatever it took to survive. But if you were caught, you were beaten. Not for stealing, but for being stupid enough to get caught. Every mistake was carved into your skin in the form of bruises, and every failure left a scar that whispered a lesson. You were underfed until your ribs showed through pale skin, underslept, so that exhaustion became your constant companion. Overwatched by men whose eyes saw every weakness, who hunted for any crack in your resolve. Every boy around you was your rival, your competition, your potential executioner. Every night was a test of will, a test that would break you or make you. If you cracked under pressure, you vanished. No funeral, no memory, nothing. Fighting wasn't just practice, it was war. You didn't fight to win, you fought to survive. Bone against bone, flesh against flesh. Instructors didn't stop the fights. They watched in silence, waiting to see who had the killer instinct. Losing gracefully? That wasn't Sparta. You stood with blood in your mouth, tasting the iron. And if you could still smile, you were one step closer to becoming what Sparta wanted. At 18, you entered the shadows. You were given a knife and told to hunt men. Not enemies, not criminals, but the helots, the slaves who worked the land. You crept through the darkness like a predator. You struck without warning, without hesitation. You killed not because they threatened you, but because it was what you were expected to do. Not only to take a life, but to do so with cold, emotionless precision. This wasn't murder, it was ritual. It was the final step in your transformation, the final piece of your soul left behind in the dirt, stained by the blood of another human being. When you returned from those hunting expeditions, there were no congratulations, no ceremony, just silence. You were simply ready, ready to be the weapon Sparta had forged from the moment you were born. But the fire didn't burn only the boys. The women of Sparta, the mothers, the sisters, the daughters, were forged in the same furnace. They weren't raised to be gentle. They were raised to be warriors. Spartan girls ran until their lungs screamed, fought until their knuckles were raw and bleeding. They threw javelins until their arms were bruised and swollen. They lifted stones and iron until their bodies were weapons too. Why? Because only strong women could give birth to strong men. Only those forged in the same fire could raise sons worthy of Sparta. These women could own land. They could speak in assemblies. They commanded respect from men who feared nothing else on earth. They weren't wives waiting for protection. They were mothers of monsters. And their blessing? Come back with your shield or on it. Weakness was a disease in Sparta. Boys watched as the helots were forced into drunken stupors, then mocked their stumbling, their falling, their foolish laughter. This, they were told, is what happens when discipline dies. This is weakness. Self-control was not a choice. It was a necessity for survival. Emotion was a threat to be eliminated. Joy was rationed like water in a drought. Every Spartan was a machine, driven only by the code. 3 classes ruled this merciless society: Spartiates, the full citizens, and elite warriors who owned everything and answered to no one. Perioeci, the traders and craftsmen who served but could never rule. And helots, the slaves whose lives meant nothing but the labor they provided. Once a year, the Crypteia purged the helots without trial or reason, only fear, and the need to remind everyone what happened when you forgot your place. Even if you survived the Agoge, even if you became a full warrior, you still didn't belong to yourself. Married at 20, but lived in the barracks until 30, you were allowed to see your wife only if you could sneak away undetected. If you were caught, you weren't punished for loving. You were punished for being careless enough to get caught. Love was private, honor was public, and the state came first, last, and always. The Gymnopedia, Sparta's festival of flesh and discipline, saw boys and girls competing naked before kings and warriors, their bodies moving like living weapons in carefully choreographed displays of control and power. Every step whispered, "I am worthy." Every gesture screamed, "I deserve to live." It wasn't performance, it was survival. Failure meant disappearing into the abyss. No retreat, no surrender, no softness, no second chances. Only honor, only legacy. Leonidas didn't march to Thermopylae to win. He marched to die correctly, to show the world what a Spartan death looked like when all else was stripped away. In Sparta, there were only 2 graves marked with names: warriors who died in battle, and women who died giving birth. Both died for Sparta. Both were remembered. Everyone else faded into nothingness, swallowed by the relentless machine. Glory wasn't free in this blood-soaked land. Every Spartan who marched into battle knew what was expected: to fight with everything, to die with pride, and to be remembered or erased based entirely on how well they served the system that forged them. The world didn't fear Sparta for its size. They feared its silence. They feared its unity. They feared its fire. So ask yourself, could you survive a single day in Sparta? Could you live without comfort, without kindness, without fear? Because in Sparta, there was no escape, no softness, no peace. Only the forge, only the code, only the brothers at your side. You weren't raised to be happy. You were raised to be unbreakable. And in the end, only one truth remained. The weak were buried in unmarked graves. The strong became legends. And mercy was treason.